For previous episodes, guest info and more, go to thevocalminorityReport.com. We are also on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and anywhere you download podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave a rating and review. Here's the show.
Previously on The Vocal Minority.
Are you part of the silent majority? Or are you part of the vocal minority?
Motherfuckers, go! Attention, please!
If America can be saved, and I don't know if it's too late, but it'll be through a radio show. Like this new kind.
This shit here feels like a whole entire world collapse. Motherfucker! The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers.
It's the vocal minority.
The revolution will be live.
Welcome to another episode of the Vocal Minority Report. As always, you could have downloaded any podcast in the world, but you're here with us. I appreciate that. Got another great show for you today. We've got a very special guest. She's a Peabody Award winning investigative reporter. She's a lead reporter and host of In the Dark, a new investigative podcast from APM Reports. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the great Madeleine Baran to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be on.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for your time today and coming on. As I mentioned to you a second ago before that intro, there's so much literally that I want to talk to you about. So, But before I get into your podcast specifically, though, and then some offshoots there, I kind of wanted to get a reporter's perspective on something that I've heard and have been hearing for years. And I know it's definitely changed for me, but I'm wondering your opinion on whether or not like newspapers are dying and if we should be worried about print media, or is digital media going to be what saves kind of print journalism? Because obviously digital media will lead to your great podcast there. So I'm just wondering your opinion on where that's going.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a media industry expert, but I mean, it's definitely, but I guess what I would say is that it is alarming to see how quickly newspapers are shrinking, and the newsrooms of those papers are shrinking, I guess. I really don't know how it's all going to shake out. I mean, on the one hand, you have that reality. And then on the other hand, you still have papers doing amazing reporting. David Fahrenthold from the Washington Post in this election cycle, his reporting on Trump's charitable giving was incredible. And, there's still a lot of newspapers out there, but the reality is that so much is transitioning to digital. And we just don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, for radio, a lot is also transitioning to digital. So it's this time of change, and I don't know that anyone really knows what this is all going to look like in 5 years. But I do hope that in this situation that the public will be very vocal about wanting investigative reporting and wanting more, in-depth, deeply reported stories. Because I think the loss of that would be pretty disastrous for democracy. If you don't have reporting that's holding powerful people and institutions accountable, then you don't really have journalism that you're supposed to have in a democracy, so that people can, have the facts and make their own decisions. I mean, that's the role of the press.
Good. I'm glad you put it that way. I like talking to journalists and reporters to get that reminder, because, I feel like we hear a lot about the press and the media that, it's sometimes used as a negative term, depending on who's saying it, obviously. And so I like to hear from a true professional as to what your take on it is, as far as what you're charged with. So, yeah. So speaking of that and what you bring to light and that level of accountability that gets into your podcast In the Dark specifically, that has captivated the masses, including me. I will say that so my plan initially, because I wanted to talk to you for a while now, I think when I talked to Rebecca Lavoie, I know you talked to her.
Okay, yeah.
Too. So I had her on and we were talking about your show. And I think at that time I was up through episode 7 and then I listened to 8. But then I was like, you know what? I'm going to wait and I'm going to binge listen to them again and then listen to 9 right before I have you on. So I attempted.
Okay.
But anyway, with that being said, though, I'm a huge fan of the podcast In the Dark. I have listened to the 8 episodes twice now. I just have to listen to episode 9, where I know there's some updates and whatnot. But for the people who haven't heard of your podcast, could you tell us about what In the Dark is?
Yeah, so In the Dark is a serialized podcast. So there's 9 episodes, and it's about the kidnapping of an 11-year-old boy named Jacob Wetterling on a dead-end street one night in 1989 in central Minnesota. And what our podcast was looking at was not, who did it, but what we were really trying to look at is the investigation and the impact of the failure to solve this for 27 years. This was a crime that was just solved a couple of weeks ago. And really what we were doing is investigating the investigation. So we were looking at, okay, this is a case that had massive resources. The Jacob Wetterling case had as many as 100 investigators working on it at one point, the FBI, state police, National Guard, local officials. And so what went wrong? And so that's the question we're trying to answer. And also, this case, although, probably a lot of people listening haven't heard of it, it is really significant nationally. This is the case that gave us the federal law that says all states have to have sex offender registries.
Right.
So it still has this impact nationally, and it can all be traced back to what happened on this dead-end road.
That's crazy. This case is just, God, there's just so much to it. Like you said, it's not really a who done it, but it's like why and what didn't they do to catch the person that did it, over this long time.
Yeah, we weren't telling it like a, detective story or something like that. We weren't trying to, be amateur sleuths or write a mystery novel. We were really looking at, okay, who's responsible for solving this crime? Law enforcement. So what exactly did they do? Because it's not a case where you can say, well, there's only one detective working on it and, he had a lot of other cases. This case was pretty unprecedented in the resources given to it. And so it seemed like a really fair case to take a look at and evaluate because, after all, we are all at the mercy of law enforcement to solve crimes that happen to us. We don't get to choose what law enforcement agency investigates crimes that happen to us or our family.
Yeah, although, but based on your reporting now, it makes me want to think about where to live. Where, if I have a part 1 crime were to happen to me. So, but we'll get into that.
Yeah.
Later on, but no. So I'm curious. How do you handle when you're set out to report on something that had no outcome? Like you said, you're investigating the investigation, but then. So I'm assuming you had a predetermined kind of, maybe I shouldn't say that. I won't assume that you had predetermined anything. I'll say that you were intending to, I guess, a certain type of production, and then the actual perpetrator of the case is found. Like Rebecca Lavoie called that a karmic gift. When I had her on, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if you all would see it that way, but I'm just curious. How did that change things for you in your reporting, or did it affect how you reported on the investigation?
Yeah, so, we'd been reporting full-time for about a year about why this case hadn't been solved, why 27 years had gone by and still no answers. And then we, released a little trailer about the podcast and explained to the public, like, hey, we're doing this. This is what this is about. And then within days, the man who did it confessed and led authorities to Jacob's remains before we'd even released the first episode.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, what we were, from a journalism perspective, of course, this is great for the family, but also from a journalism perspective, this is good because, if we're trying to answer the question of what went wrong, the only thing that we still didn't know was who did it and how they did it. And so we had, a list of mistakes, but we didn't know which ones really mattered the most. Which ones are just mistakes that things you shouldn't do, and which ones, maybe would have caught the guy.
Right.
And so knowing that, knowing what he did, knowing what kind of car he was in, all of that, we could make our reporting much more clear. And, it was a bit of we were definitely, working a lot, especially those first 2 weeks after the confession, to try to go back into the episodes because they hadn't been released yet and, make some changes and do some additional reporting, which we have in the last episode, so that we could tell this part of the story. One of the things that was really good about it as well, I think, for us, was that we wanted to tell this story about this man, Dan Rassier, who was called a person of interest in the case.
Right.
But we had this concern, and really struggled with this about, okay, so we're going to do this episode about him, but what we don't want to happen is that, it only casts further suspicion on him. That people listening to it say, okay, well, maybe most people listening say, okay, I don't think he did it, but some people think, you know what, I think he did. And, I'm going to go online, I'm going to go on Reddit and, post about it and basically further ruin his life. So being able to tell that episode when we knew firmly it was not him just ethically felt much better. And we were able to be much more clear and not worry about whether or not we were being clear enough that we didn't think he did it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, sometimes we hear about, that people don't or need to present an alternate suspect or whatever. In this case, there was not just an alternate suspect. There was the person who did it. He admitted to it. So you definitely were able to clear or help clear his name because I wanted to talk about him too, or what happened to him because, talking about these societal repercussions, sex offender registry, but then there's also the falsely accused and people being targeted and the fear mongering that, all of these things, I guess that a poor investigation lends itself to. There's the crime, obviously, that is terrible, but then these offshoots, because if it's not solved quickly, as, we hear a lot, the first 48, but then, I believe I heard one of your folks say, within the first 5 hours or so, or
right.
When it comes to a child abduction. And so anyway, so there's so much there. So I'm wondering, okay, so I have a series of questions that may not go linearly, maybe. There we go. Good Lord. Yes. Thank you.
Let's say in chronological order.
There we go. In chronological order.
That word is terrible to pronounce.
Yes. So I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you for helping me there. So I'll just, so I'm apologizing in advance as I may just pepper you with random questions about what you just kind of found out in the investigation. Oh, here's one thing. So I've seen you in an article that you wanted to avoid sensationalism in the reporting of the story. And I'm wondering do you think you all succeeded or you succeeded in doing that? And
I think so. I mean, what we wanted to do was really help the listener empathize with the people in the story. So, it wasn't like a true crime story where, there's all these gruesome details and then, you feel more like separated from the case and you kind of look at it and say, well, that was crazy. And you kind of gawk at it and it becomes a spectacle.
Right.
We wanted to draw people in. And I think, part of it, why it worked was because so many people were so generous with their time. I mean, I think, the Wetterlings in particular, letting us see what it was really like for them so that this isn't some abstract thing. This is their son and what this has meant for them. The phone ringing in their house nonstop.
Right.
The psychics, all of that. Being on Geraldo. We got a really good sense, I think, as best we can, not having lived through it, of what this would be like.
Definitely.
And so there's more of this, drawing people in and making people realize the true impact of this. And then I also think, a lot of true crime is really focused on the genius of the criminal or the perceived genius of the criminal.
Right.
How did this guy pull this off? And for us, turning the focus onto law enforcement just made for a very different story. Like, we didn't buy into this notion of the perfect criminal or the perfect crime. And so we weren't, doing lots and lots of episodes about, what a genius this guy was. I mean, we were really focused on law enforcement. Of course, we did have details of what happened, and that was something that, we went back and forth about, what do you include, what don't you include? We didn't include all of what this man Heinrich confessed to.
Okay.
But we included what we thought we needed to tell the story.
Yeah, and I think it was, and as someone who listened to it, I believe it was enough. As well, like I said, I haven't listened to the update ones, but through episode 8, and when he admitted to it in court and the other details, because I think there's a fine line there. And I was going to ask you too about the level of freedom maybe in this type of reporting, doing a podcast versus how you tell the story on public radio or in print, as far as because you do get to, you don't have to censor yourself, or you don't have to censor what people say. You know, if they say fuck, they say fuck. You know what I mean? So, pardon my French, but you know what I mean. So,
but no, I mean, we don't have that. Yeah, it's a real restriction that you would have if you were on broadcast, definitely.
And I'm wondering if that, I don't know. To me, it adds to the story. You know, when you just have this kind of raw emotion and hearing these voices. But for you, and obviously you've been doing stories like this before, but this medium, did that lend itself? Did you find anything different there that really helped how you told the story of the investigation and, you know, what happened to Jacob?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was the first podcast I'd done, so it's a new experience. But I think a couple things, you know, from the listener's perspective, you can choose when you want to listen to this. So obviously some of this is going to be pretty difficult to hear. But unlike something that's on the radio, you know, you're not like driving to work and all of a sudden you turn on the radio and you hear some description of what happened to this boy.
Right.
You know, you can choose it. And I think from a reporting perspective, I mean, this is a complicated story. And I don't know how we would have done this story, you know, in just, you know, more standard radio slots, you know, a series of 4-minute stories or something. I don't think it would have worked. And, you know, it's too complicated. And then also, you know, when you listen to a podcast, you can like you did, you know, go back and like binge all of these. So we don't have to do as much reminding people of what just happened in the last story. So we can just stay in the story and just move forward. And then we don't have to, you know, have all episodes be the same length.
Right.
They can just be as long as they need to be to tell the story. So I think it's great. I mean, I think it's great for investigative reporting, and in particular because, you know, there's also this audience for it, which is incredible. So
Right.
we can take the time to do it right. I mean, like kind of like Making of Murderer did on Netflix. You know, people were willing to stick through that thing. I mean, I think I watched it all in like 3 days.
Right, me too.
Not more than that, you know, and that's a lot of stuff to watch, you know, and a lot of people did the same thing. So it's really encouraging as a reporter that the people are willing to do that and want to do that. You know, people realize that criminal justice system, such an important issue and a complicated one.
Right. And I think, and to go back to why yours was so interesting, this because, you know, we hear about, you know, if we talk about Serial, you know, or you listen to Undisclosed, you know, you hear about, or any of the other offshoots, how poor the investigations were, or how, you know, the crime rate in Baltimore. So you got to, you know, you have to move them from the red to the black or whatever. But we hear about those, but not the level, you know, of them in depth, and where you actually got to talk to multiple agencies and sit there and what sounds awkward in talking to the sheriff. And I definitely want to get into, we could spend like another hour talking about my man, Sheriff Sander. But okay, so I told you I'm going to be a little off the map here.
Yeah, no.
So you talked about, though, Jacob's mother and father, Mr. and Mrs. Wetterling. And I was just curious, and it kind of comes out a little bit in their conversation, but I know you talked to them for a long time, but did you sense any like lingering sense of resentment in mom towards dad still, or maybe vice versa? Like, I you know, over what happened that night, or how they, or just, you know, their reactions. Like, do you still sense that in their conversations? And then I guess to that end though, like, how painful was it, or I guess how difficult was it, I guess, when and I know you're used to this being an investigative reporter, asking tough questions and dealing with people who've dealt with tragedy, but I'm just curious, you know, just their relationship and how that came across to you as a reporter versus kind of how maybe it sounded to us, if that long question makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I guess, you know, I see them as really coming together. You know, it's not real that you would never have moments of tension or argument, you know, in any relationship. And certainly, you know, when you have something like this happen to your family, it is going to be difficult, not just for the obvious reasons, but also because people react differently to trauma. And so all of a sudden, you've got people reacting differently to the same thing, and that's hard. But I think they have a pretty strong connection. I mean, and I didn't sense that there was lingering, you know, bitterness or something like that. I mean, kind of what Patty said was that she That was a mean thing to say. Why? Well, who let them go to the store?
Right.
Like she feels bad about that.
Okay.
And yet, you can imagine saying that. So I think it's just great that they were so open, because what wouldn't be realistic is to say, well, we never had these conversations. It's like, really? And I think most people would. And so they were just very real. And I guess as a reporter sitting there, I didn't really know what to expect. And part of me wondered if, it would be, I guess I wondered if they had talked about this so many times that we would just kind of go through everything that happened very quickly. And my problem would actually be the opposite, that, it would sound like something, they had talked about lots of times. But what was surprising to me is they really hadn't been asked to go in that type of detail back over what had happened. I mean, they were very willing to do it, but it was just something that they realized in the moment, when we were asking about, for example, like the media that night, and they realized that they didn't have the same recollection of that, whether or not the sheriff said they could call reporters or whether it was on the radio that night that Jacob had been kidnapped. So as a reporter, a lot of, in those situations, my job, I think, is to basically say nothing, just to let it unfold and see where it goes. But I think it, gave you a pretty good sense of how hard this has been, and I think a realistic sense of what this kind of trauma would do to a family. That there are moments of tension like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely a human. I don't know. Definitely a good. Can't think of a good look into some strength and I guess some good honesty too. So I'm curious. Do they feel any solace in knowing that Heinrich is in jail now? I mean, I guess that might be an obvious question, but how do they feel now that Heinrich is behind bars and admitted to the crime?
Yeah, so I talked to them after the case was solved, and they're still going through so many different emotions. And I talked to them, they really weren't sleeping a whole lot. They were glad to know what had happened. They wanted to know what had happened. And so they were that's what they wanted. But, on the other hand, what they found out was that their son was dead. And so any lingering chance that he wasn't was gone.
Okay.
And, I think that they had both kind of held on to that hope that maybe somehow he would still be alive.
Right.
And so that was tough. And then to hear, the description of what this man who kidnapped and killed him said in court, some of Jacob's last words were very painful for them to hear. One of the things that we mentioned in the podcast is when Jacob was kidnapped, he turned, at least according to Danny Heinrich said Jacob turned to him and said, "What did I do wrong?"
Right.
So that's very painful. And, it's a different life for them. They've lived in this mode for so long of, the phone ringing all the time with all of these like psychic and other leads or so-called leads, not knowing, having all of these conversations about what could have happened. And now they know. And so it's like, well, what is life like now? And I think they're still figuring that out.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I have anyway, I guess everyone always says this. I have 2 children. I can't imagine just one being gone and then 20, and I guess I would think that at some point over 27 years you would, but I guess if there's no closure, then you wouldn't. You would hold on hope that maybe he is still alive. Okay. So no, that's, wow.
Yeah, people react differently to it. It depends on the family. One of the things Patty told me was that early on, a friend of the family had told her that, she gets to choose how she wants to look at it. There was no evidence that Jacob was dead, so she could choose to believe he was alive.
Right.
And, she didn't want to give up hope that could be possible, even though she knew that, the chances of that were not great. But then, she's very involved nationally with the parents of other kids who've been kidnapped. And there are, it's very rare, but there are cases where, maybe not that long after that I'm aware of, but, 10 years later, there's a person and they're alive. I mean, it's already a really rare crime.
Right.
And then rarer still for the person to survive, but it does happen. And I think, that sort of gives you the hope that you might be one of those cases.
Yeah, right. And hope is hope, right? Yeah, that makes sense. You would hope that he's happy and healthy, just under a different name or something. Okay, no. So so now I guess we'll get more into the investigation part of it, because it's very obvious or shocking that, because what you found is that it wasn't just Jacob. There were other boys that were having other issues. There was a real Chester the molester, really in the area.
Right.
Not like the mythical thing that, and probably in everybody's, neighborhood or town where, there was
yes.
Mommy, the little song or whatever, but there was one really going on in this. And I don't know I'm not sure how big the area we're talking about is here because, so I think, Painesville versus where Jacob was.
It's about a 25-minute drive.
Okay.
But Painesville itself is tiny. It's like 2 square miles, had about 2,000 people in it.
Okay. Because I was trying to figure out how the news would not have, I'm in Dallas. So, if you're 25 miles away from, you're going to hear local news from, whatever major suburbs we have within 25 miles or whatever, but every area is different. But from a law enforcement standpoint, the close nature of this and so many things that are the same, the blue car and, there's all these things that just keep popping up. The question there is, how shocked were you by, I guess, the simple investigative tactics not being done, especially when you consider that, 25 miles it's not a walk around the corner and that's a small town, but to me, that just doesn't seem that far off. But, I can't picture the ruralness of that area necessarily either.
Yeah. No, there's not a whole lot. There's one big city, St. Cloud, and then there's a bunch of smaller towns, and then of maybe 2,000 people, 3,000 people, and then it's just farmland in between. And it's all in the same county. So I guess to me what was significant was it's so rare for a child to be abducted.
Oh, it's in the same county. Okay, that's okay.
Yeah,
okay.
And so it had happened twice in the same county in the same year. And then before that, in the town of Painesville, also in the same county, you had all of these other assaults on boys, by this strange man basically jumping out of bushes. Like you said, a real life Chester the molester, like someone the kids talked about as Chester the molester. And so to not put all these things together seemed very significant to us because, it's not as though we're talking about a crime that happens all the time. And so there's no reason to think that they're connected. There's every reason to think that these could be connected. And it seems as though some law enforcement did believe that they were connected, and yet they still weren't able to solve it.
Right. Yeah. See, and that's the most, well, obviously that's one of the most troubling things. And, and I was watching Killing Fields on the Discovery Channel. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but.
No, I haven't.
But they were reinvestigating a cold case from 18 years ago where this young lady, Eugenie, was murdered. But anyway, and it was just a real-time investigation of that crime 18 years later by the same detective and some new eyes. And while it's done great, all I kept thinking though, and it might be because of you, is that, man, why didn't he do all these things 18 years ago? And really how terrible of a cop he is in his investigation, because I heard a lot of people say too now where, they talk about, different training and tactics and advances made. But some of the stuff that you note and some of the things that I saw him lack, and this is not an indictment necessarily of that officer or detective at the same time, though, it's like these are simple things, simple investigative tactics that just aren't done. And to do them years later just really irritated me because I'm like,
right.
Like in this one, they cleared the ex-husband with just a phone call. They called him. He said he was not available.
Wow.
And then 18 years later, now he's lawyered up. It's a really crazy story. So anyway, I'm just, like I said, but had they just done their job differently all that time ago, and it's just a parallel to this case where, you talk about the simple knocking on doors and the time frame and your circle. I don't know if that's an analogy or a metaphor that you did with the circle, but I thought that was wonderful. Where the circle starts small, and you've got to find them before it gets too big. And it seems like the bumbling of the investigation led to that circle getting so large. So
exactly. And, I'm glad that like the podcast has made people think this way about some of these cold cases, because like you said, I mean, these are not, I guess when people think about times have changed, it's 20 years later, 25 years later, can you really fault law enforcement? It's like, well, maybe not if what we're talking about is, very minute amounts of DNA or, these sorts of things. It just, DNA testing really became a thing in the 90s. And so, or Amber Alerts, but we're really not talking about that. And I think in a lot of cases, that is not the issue. It's much more simple than that. It's, one of the law enforcement trainers in our podcast, when I asked, how long these techniques had been around, he said forever. Sherlock Holmes,
Right.
Yeah, so this is really basic stuff, talking to the neighbors, talking to people more than once, talking to, lots of people. I mean, this, and I think that's probably the case with more cases than we might think, that, the failures are really that basic and they don't have to do with technology. And, talking to detectives who've worked a lot of cases, most of them said, really all of them said, you might get lucky and get some DNA that solves it for you, but really the heart of an investigation is the stuff that really has not changed. Talking to people, taking people's statements, collecting evidence from the scene. I mean, these are things that have been a part of criminal investigations for as long as there have been criminal investigations. And so I think that it's interesting to think about a lot of these like cold case shows in a different way. Like you're talking about, that, okay, it's great that someone's trying to solve it now, but also what happened back then that made it a cold case?
Right. Yeah, because it seems like in this, I mean, this is, pardon the pun, but these people necessarily weren't in the dark. They weren't, some are hiding in plain sight a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're set in on this one thing, and as we talked about, these persons of interest, and people just get caught up in this one, and meanwhile, a lot of people are being harmed and abused and or killed while the police are out there focusing on other things. So I to that point though, it seems like it's obviously very easy to find people not involved in the specific investigations to be critical of what was or wasn't done, which makes sense because they're looking at it hopefully objectively. But I'm curious, if you found anyone involved in this actual case. And I believe I did hear at least one FBI agent, or I think,
yeah,
that but so I wonder if there's anybody else though that in hindsight was critical of the work that they or their agency actually did at the time.
Yeah, in the podcast we have just the one. We have this FBI special agent in charge, this guy named Jeff Jamar, who said, "Look, we failed." And then I did talk to a detective more recently who worked on the case who said the same thing. But by and large, I mean, people were not reflective on that. I mean, they really weren't. And to me, that was one of the more striking things in this reporting. It's like everybody makes mistakes. But the question is, what do you do when you make a mistake? Do you learn from it? What do you do to prevent yourself from making the same mistake again? And in this case, I don't think that that's something, I mean, I know that that's something that's not how people viewed it. And which is, you can see then how things wouldn't improve if that was your mindset. That really it's the fault of the criminal and this case was really hard and there's absolutely nothing I could have done that would have changed the outcome.
Because sometimes you just have to get lucky, right?
Well, that is what the sheriff said, right? I mean, that is actually what he said. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I just had to throw that in there because it's so outrageous. But again, so I'll ask you to offer your opinion. So what do you think that is? Is it denial, shame, embarrassment? This case clearly is a specific failure. You go on to note, other cases and, obviously, we'll talk about the clearance rates as well. So I'm curious, what do you see it as? And I guess being an investigative reporter, you're able to probably offer an opinion, but obviously you have a more educated thought maybe on it too as well. Cause this is the first time you've seen probably ineptitude in a place of power. I know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, well, from the interviews with the law enforcement I talked to, one thing, I don't know, I guess, that totally answer that question, but one thing that stood out to me was that, just how many hours they worked. And so a lot of law enforcement would stress, look, like, we did everything we could. We were working 18-hour days. And it's true that they were working 18-hour days. And it's true that they were, on ATVs and in helicopters searching. But what they seemed less reflective of was, well, what kind of work were we doing? And so there was some sensitivity around criticizing when they had been working that long. So I don't know if that had something to do with it. I also think, there's no process in place to evaluate when these cases go wrong. If you work in a hospital and someone dies unexpectedly, a lot of hospitals will do a review of some type of what went wrong. And there is just nothing like that institutionally in the sheriff's office. And also, there were people in the sheriff's office who, in later years, one guy I talked to in this case of this police officer who was killed, who said, yeah, there's dissent, but given the politics of the sheriff's office, it's hard to really voice that and have it go anywhere.
Man, I want to get into the sheriff's office. I keep saying I want to get into so much stuff because I want to talk about the sheriffs and I want to talk about the kind of the election stuff there. But I guess before we get on that, So let me ask you about your feeling on law enforcement taking credit for or congratulating themselves years later for a case that, for all intents and purposes, was botched initially and for years. Like in this case, you play the press conference. I guess there's a couple, but there's certainly no apology for anyone they may have wronged and falsely accused. And there's seemed to be patting on the back and congratulations for a job well done. 27 years later. That struck me as odd, obviously, and I'm curious, your opinion on that. Hey, well, we got him. How do you feel about that? If there's no accountability or acceptance of failure, it seems very odd to kind of showboat the success of, again, which is a major failure all these years later.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it's like, what I do as a reporter is like put the facts out there, and then here's what they were saying about it. And then, it's really up to the public to decide, okay, there's clearly very little accountability right now.
Okay.
And, watching this press conference and there's really, no oversight. There's nobody who would say, well, wait a minute, we're actually going to require you to do these 3 things so this doesn't happen again. So the question is, do people think that there should be that, or what would that look like? I was certainly struck by it, but, especially given, the facts of the case, that there's all kinds of different ways to respond to the case being solved. But that was striking to me when you consider the fact that really the only reason it was solved was because the person who did it led them to the body.
Right. Yeah, like two decades plus later. Yes, I mean, geez.
Right, and that it was someone that was in their sights so early, and again, the lack of self-reflection. No statements like, "Well, okay, clearly, we have some searching to do, or we have some we need to examine this and figure out what are some policies, what are some training that we can put in place, so that we don't do this again." So when we're given a serious crime to solve, we do a better job of solving it.
Right. Yeah. And so with that, it makes me wonder, so is the Justice Department letting us down with their tracking and keeping data of, regarding sex offenses by strangers? And obviously, I want to spend the time on the clearance rates. Your reporting got me all fired up. I even went on a mini Twitter rant at the Department of Justice last month, asking them about, are you guys addressing these Part 1 offense clearance rates, being the single digits and just.
Did they write back?
No.
Did you get a response?
They didn't.
From the Justice Department? Oh, yeah.
I did not. And so I sent that on October 19th, and what's today? November 17th. So as of today, there has not been a response. And and it's my fault because I meant to go on a mini campaign, and actually maybe I still will now. And you know what? And I suggest this might, I'm going to galvanize the people here maybe.
Okay.
But people should ask that question though, because before you mentioned it, I had no idea about any of this. And I'm assuming that a lot of people who heard this podcast didn't either. So the question is, is it the responsibility of the Justice Department to come in and do something about these low performing places and offer better reporting? And then so with that, I should probably start with a rundown of what clearance rates are in Part 1 crimes, or maybe I could have you do that. But so it gives more context of what we're talking about. But
yeah, I can explain that. So clearance rate is the percentage of your crimes that are not solved, but in which there's an arrest that leads to charges. Like the person doesn't have to be convicted, but they have to be, caught essentially. And we looked at the clearance rates for major crimes only. So they're called Part 1 crimes. So what that doesn't include are things like DWIs or vandalizing a mailbox or graffiti or something like that, like crimes that, we don't really think are worth including because, frankly, there's often a low probability that, nor do we really probably mostly think it's a good idea if the police were to focus only on trying to catch people who graffiti places. But the major crimes, we expect
right
those to be prioritized. So, and then this clearance rate is completely voluntary. What happens in the United States is that these local law enforcement agencies voluntarily report their clearance rates up to, often through the state police, up through, who then report it to the FBI. And then the FBI compiles all of these numbers of all these clearance rates from thousands of law enforcement agencies across the country. But they don't do any kind of enforcement or anything. I mean, they just collect the information. So, there's not, the numbers are not very easy to analyze. And also, there's no benchmark. There's no, the FBI doesn't say, law enforcement, you should aim to clear 60% of your major crimes.
Okay.
Or anything like that. There's nothing like that. And so what you have in the United States is some places that are doing a really good job solving major crimes, are solving, at really high rates, or clearing rather at really high rates. And then you have other places that really are struggling and are in the single digits. And when you think about what that means, it's pretty incredible. If a place has a 5% clearance rate, then 95% of crimes are going unsolved.
Right. It's scary and maddening.
Is there even law enforcement? And what is sort of the tipping point of where if you're not solving crimes, or it's essentially you're not enforcing the law? So it was, I'm glad to see so many people being like, you know what, I'm going to look at my clearance rate. And because especially when we're talking about, and rightfully so, police accountability. And so I think that this topic should be added to it because, this is one of the key functions of law enforcement, solving crimes.
Right.
This is one of the main reasons they even exist. And yet we do not hold them accountable, and we really don't even know the data. I didn't know the clearance rates before I did this reporting. And so I hope that it encourages people to look up their clearance rate, to ask questions of their local law enforcement about crime solving, and not wait until all of a sudden you or someone in your family is a victim of violent crime and you realize, oh man, I live in a place that doesn't solve these.
Right. Yes.
So I'm glad it's starting that conversation because, otherwise all kinds of horrible things can happen. Wrong people can be accused. People can go on to commit other crimes because they weren't caught. And people can live with this uncertainty. Not just of murder, but, people who are assaulted and the person is never caught and they have to live with that uncertainty of where is this person? Is this person going to do this again? And it just depends on where they live.
Right. Yeah. Because it's scary. It makes you think about all the. It's funny because I've had enough people on this show and we've heard enough cases where, people don't fully know we hear a lot of crimes that happen all across the country, but the outcomes I don't know that we hear tons of those, like you hear a tragic murder the night before, but I don't know what percentage of arrests are actually reported or actually done, in major cities. And so, so there are, it's scary to know how many killers or rapists or, these violent offender are actually walking around just because of bad clearance rates and forces or agencies not being equipped to do this. Here's a quick plug for my own show, but we have an episode called Police Integrity Lost, where we talk with criminologist Phil Stinson about his research on police misconduct. But we're speaking of just, kind of bad cops and the things that lead to that, not even looking at, hey, that I guess if you're doing your job poorly in small ways and having, issues with alcohol and women and financial problems, some of those things can also lead into the lack of investment. And I may be making a big reach here, but, who knows what could be contributing to these low clearance rates and why things aren't being done. So
and there's no research. Or there's very little research into that question.
Right.
So, you could have a place, like we saw some places, 95% clearance rate, other places with 5% clearance rate, and we don't know. And to me, it's kind of like in a hospital not knowing anything about infections and just saying, wow, like some hospitals certainly seem to have a lot of infections of patients and others seem to have very few, and I have no idea why that is. Answer, hand washing. In large part. But, so what is that thing? And the reason we know that is because it was studied.
Right.
It seems kind of obvious, but it almost was too obvious, when like they instituted, like the checklist for how to wash your hands. Some people were like, you got to be kidding me. I know how to wash my hands. But the reality is that like that simple act, not expensive, basically costs almost nothing, really drove down the infection rate. And so I wonder for crime solving, what are those things? Because we can guess, is it more detectives, better training? But it might not be. It's a really big open question. And it's not something, the places, there's also the flip side. The places that are doing a really good job sometimes don't even know that they're doing a really good job.
Right.
And they aren't, going around the country for the most part, doing trainings to the places that are low performing. So there's not a whole lot of opportunity to learn from places that are doing a good job. And the other thing that was surprising to me is that some of the better rates of clearances were not in big cities. The big cities were by and large much worse at solving crime or clearing crime than more rural areas, non-urban areas, which kind of goes against,
right,
what I think a lot of people assume. Like if you have all the fancy gear and the CSI stuff and the big budget, you're probably going to solve more cases.
Of course, right.
It turns out not to be the case in a lot of places.
Yeah, no, and I thought that was interesting when you guys pointed to the reasons, because I'm thinking Barney Fife is investigating it, but you guys pointed out the reasons as to why that may not be the case based on familiarity and some other things there. So let's get on Stearns County specifically, because you mentioned that, or you all basically found out there was basically, I would say, over an 80% chance that your crime won't be solved in Stearns County. And so my question is, how did you, in that specific moment of were you all face to face when you were talking to Sheriff Sanner?
Yes.
Okay, I thought.
Yeah, we were in his office.
Okay, I thought so. So, how did you go over those questions with him with a straight face? Like, I know you're an award-winning professional, but I can't imagine at that moment when you ask him, because to me, you clearly already know the answer to the question when you're about to ask him, does he know his crime rate? I'm assuming you knew he was going to say he didn't know, or his clearance rate.
I really didn't know.
Okay.
I really didn't know. Yeah.
Okay. Well then, even not knowing, even just based on the response, and because he was killing me the whole time. Like you described him shrugging his shoulders, his unwillingness to admit anything really, his theories, what to me came across as indifference sometimes. So I'm just, again, maybe it was nothing for you because you're a professional, but was it difficult or is it ever difficult when someone's answering in such a way that is, I don't even know how to describe it, but just it just seemed like, dude, like, really, man, come on, like, are you you really don't know what's going on? It just seemed very crazy to me, and I'm just wondering how you handle that in the moment.
Yeah, it is surprising, right? I mean, these are his numbers after all. I mean, these are his clearance rates.
Right.
So if anyone should have those numbers, it should be him, most likely, not me, or maybe both of us.
Right.
And he did that multiple times. I mean, at one point he asked me what I think should be done to improve the clearance rates. And I said, I have no idea. I have no idea.
I'm not the sheriff. Right.
Right. I mean, so I guess for me, one of the most important things in an interview like that is to be very prepared.
Okay.
And so, I wanted to make sure that I had that graph of the clearance rates, but I also had, read all of his previous statements. I had all my questions ready to go because it was a really important interview. I mean, here's the guy, the elected official, the sheriff, who's the one who's accountable to the public. And I, as a stand-in for the public here, I need to ask these questions. And I think one thing that was revealing in that interview was, like you said, exactly how he answered those questions. That sometimes he would, pause for a really long time or shrug his shoulders or, in the case of talking about the one reporter, make a gesture like he was trying to strangle someone. I mean,
right.
And so there were things he was doing in those interviews that I thought were providing some insight into his personality. But, I mean, you really never know. And the important thing, I think, too, is to go in with a complete open mind. I mean, obviously, I know a fair amount of facts at that point. But, you want to go in genuinely curious about what he has to say and open to the possibility that maybe you're wrong on some stuff because you never know. And you could totally be wrong. So you're going in that way, not knowing. And for me, I guess what stood out to me was a couple things: the clearance rates, his explanation for why he named this man Dan a person of interest.
Right.
That he answered that question, and that he said it came down to the fact that Dan had talked to a local paper, and that when I asked him how it helped the investigation, he said he didn't know. I mean, that seemed pretty significant to me, and. And again, like with so many of the people I talked to in the story in law enforcement, the lack of self-reflection as well came through. So my job is to capture that and to get the answers to some of these questions. But you never know. And so, yeah, there is like a kind of a moment, I mean, when I handed him the graph of his clearance rates, I didn't know what he was going to say. And so
that's when I wish this was a documentary instead of a podcast. So
you could see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, I've played it out a million times. I wish I could see it because I just see anyway. So yeah. But you
can picture it. I mean.
You all captured it so well that it's probably better this way because I have my own interpretation because of how you captured it. So yeah, for sure. And that leads me now into the person of interest part, because we've talked about the other. So you've got Danny Heinrich, and he is the actual one who did it. And then you have Dan, his name is Rassier, who was noted as the person of interest. And we talked about the sheriff making the choking gesture with the reporter. And so let's talk about person of interest. And you said it's a vague phrase with no legal meaning, but it sure means something to everyone who hears it. And obviously, and you'd hate to have that phrase attributed to you. It's certainly makes some folks pariahs and made, Dan specifically a pariah. And even I guess until this day, probably until Heinrich turned himself in, admitted to it. So. And we talk about that reporter, and she told you that the story kind of spoke for itself, I guess, as her justification for running with him as a person of interest. And so, we talk a lot about the media's role in coloring what we see and how we take it in. And so how do you feel about that specific as it relates to person of interest? The sheriff and law enforcement naming people that, and then once that is named, then what? What responsibility does the media have, or do journalists have, when they have that information and how they disseminate that to us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think first of all, just because law enforcement says something doesn't mean the media has to report it. I mean, it's not as though law enforcement always tells the truth, right?
Right.
So, I mean, that might be something you want to report. It might not be something you want to report. And then also, I mean, there's no definition. Like, this term person of interest doesn't mean anything, or it means whatever people want it to mean or think it means. I mean, clearly it's nothing positive. Clearly it's, no one wants to be named this.
Right.
But so I think, a very important question is if a law enforcement official says, well, so-and-so is a person of interest, is to ask, well, what does that mean to you? What are you saying? Are you saying they're a suspect? And then the question is, do you name a suspect? I mean, for the most part, places where I've worked, you don't name people who are in that category. I mean, maybe there are some exceptions, but of course, like, tons of people get arrested who didn't do it, in whatever the case is, or are never charged. And so you have to be, I think the media has a very big responsibility here to be very careful about when they're going to name someone, name a private person living in a community, and point, the finger at them and cast suspicion on them for committing a crime that they haven't been charged for, or in this case, even arrested for, because that's a completely life-altering decision. I mean, you cannot undo that. There's been, many examples of this in the media, and is it so bad to not report that? Why do you need to report that exactly? And a lot of cases are going to have a lot of possible suspects, and the way our system is supposed to work is that law enforcement has to prove those cases, even, have probable cause to charge someone.
Right.
Let alone a jury convict them. So I think it shows, I think that what happened to Dan, who, after all, I mean, Dan, when this crime happened, he's 33 years old, he's living with his parents, he's a music teacher, and he just happens to live right next to where this crime happened, where Jacob was kidnapped. And he happens to see a blue car drive down his driveway around the same time. And he didn't choose those things.
Right.
And yet, there he is. And it has made me think about, what that would be like. One day you're going about your regular stuff, and then this horrific crime happens. And just because you live there, of course, I mean, he doesn't fault them for looking at him. But, I mean, he understood that they would need to look at him because he lived right there and because he was home alone that night. But it's where it goes from that to a public thing is really where he had a lot of concern. And, this term, I mean, it has evolved over time. I mean, now you hear it all the time. You used to hear the word suspect more. But person of interest is kind of this phrase that, because it doesn't really mean anything, you can use it and not have to really account for it.
Right.
And as reporters, we should not be using words that don't have a definition.
Okay, I like that. I think that's a very succinct way to sum it up.
I mean, it sounds basic, right? Like only use words that you know the meaning of.
Right. Yes.
I think that's probably a universal thing, But
yeah, and then that's what we tell our children. That's what you say. If you don't know what I told my daughter the other day, you know what it means, don't say it. So right.
Right. Exactly. Like, this is a high concept thing, right?
Right.
Or the thing that's unique to reporters, and also I think to the public too. I mean, if you see a news story where someone is called a person of interest, be a little skeptical of that. If you're concerned about it, write to the reporter and say, or write to law enforcement, say, what does that even mean? Instead of just assuming that it must mean that this person did it. To be a little more skeptical of that phrase. And, especially in the case of Dan, I've heard from a lot of people since the podcast has come out who feel really bad, like people who lived in the town where he lived, who think, man, why was I so quick to accept this and feel this way about, the guy down the street?
Right. Yeah. Just because this ultimate echo chamber, the police say it and then the media says it. And then, we just kind of get roped into this one thing, not knowing, with this made up term, this catch-all. So, and I guess that probably has a lot to, I would assume, to do with litigation purposes, where, they probably got sued for saying suspect, so they had to switch it to something that would keep them from this ambiguous term that would keep them from getting sued. I don't have any idea there, but that's just my.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a little bit of research into it that suggests that that's part of it, at least, that people had sued because of the word suspect. And so people started using person of interest. And, of course, that doesn't completely protect you from getting sued, but it does seem like it was a shift that happened in part because of that, because of the lawsuits.
Okay.
But it really isn't any, I mean, it's, I guess it doesn't have a meaning. It doesn't for sure mean suspect, but people think it does. I mean,
right.
Nobody thinks person of interest means innocent.
No.
Or friendly witness, I mean.
No, not at all.
No, I mean, I would be shocked if that's what the majority of people thought it meant.
No, I would agree with you there for sure. Let's, I want to go back and kind of talk about the sheriff specifically and the power that they have. I'll mention Rebecca for the third time, just because in our conversation, we talked about this, and I guess because of In the Dark, we were talking about the lack of accountability and oversight for sheriffs once they're elected. And then, like, for instance, like in Dallas County, we have Sheriff Lupe Valdez. She's going on her fourth term here, and she actually, I don't know really much about what she does, because I guess because Dallas County is so large. She's openly gay, she's female, she's Hispanic, so I know those things, and that I believe work in her favor. But it's a larger county. I don't know how she runs the jails, but I do know that she's going on her fourth term, which is a really long time, considering that, we don't have mayors that long. Like no one else is going on their fourth term except for like a few county commissioners and whatever else. So I'm digressing there a little bit, but the point of that is just thinking it got, because of your reporting and then that conversation, and then after last Tuesday, and when I heard it get elected again, it got me thinking about, man, like that's a lot of power for a long time. And then as it relates to smaller areas, so I'm wondering, can you speak to what's going on with these sheriffs? I guess more specific to rural areas, and how there is, and I think we touched on it earlier, but how there is that kind of lack of oversight, and how that might attribute to the poor investigations and the lack of clearance rates. Maybe I don't know if I know those things don't all go together, but I'm thinking that there's definitely some things that relate there.
Yeah, so there's about 3,000 sheriffs in the U.S. and they're almost all elected, and it's completely unlike other law enforcement. The police chief isn't elected, the head of the FBI is not elected, head of the CIA is not elected, and so we've chosen to elect our sheriffs. And so a lot of the sheriffs would say, well, that's the ultimate accountability. You're accountable to the public. They can vote you out. But what I think has happened in a lot of cases is that people don't have the kind of information that they would need about the sheriff to really make an informed decision. And, clearance rates are part of that. There's other things too. But, it is something that still, for the most part, is elected. Some places, very few, have switched to, having a sheriff appointed by a county board, for example. But, sheriffs are very powerful. I mean, in rural areas, one of the reasons they're so powerful is because in most cases, they are acting as the law enforcement agency in charge of solving major crimes. In a lot of urban areas, they're playing a different role. They're running, sheriffs everywhere, many of them are running jails.
Right.
So regardless of where it is, it's a position with a lot of power. I mean, if you're running a jail, that's a pretty powerful position. And, are responsible for all the conditions there and how things work and how, the employees of the jail are treated. I mean, all of that. And it's just a type of job where we really don't, for the most part, know very much about these people. And yet, every couple years we go to vote and we circle or fill in the oval next to one of these people's names with so much less information, certainly than we'd have for president or, senator or anything like that.
Right.
And so, and nowhere do the sheriffs, the elected sheriffs have any oversight. I mean, the way that law enforcement works in the U.S. is completely decentralized. Like, to me, one of the more surprising things in the story, the reporting, was the fact that no one knows how many police departments there are in the United States.
Right.
You think about that. So there's just, we've decided, like, your politicians have decided in this country that we're going to have a completely decentralized law enforcement system, that only the FBI will be a federal agency. And so everyone else can sort of, do as they would like, set up their own rules, their own agencies. And that's how we get to this situation where we don't have good data in this country. We have like places with really wide-ranging differences in how good of a job they're doing. And there's nobody who intervenes, when a sheriff messes up, like as a matter of course. Like, you could have a place that just never solves crime. And if people don't know that and they keep electing the sheriff, no one is going to come in and try to do it and do anything about it, like as a matter of policy. It can just continue. And so I hope that, what the podcast does is get people educated on these clearance rates. I mean, you can look up there's a place called the Murder Accountability Project where you can look up the murder clearance rate. The Part 1 clearance rate, I think, is almost more important because it's more crimes. It's statistically more significant. And the best way to get that is usually from like an annual report that the sheriff's office where, you live might release and just doesn't get any attention. But if you went online to the sheriff's office or emailed them, they would, probably more likely than not have those numbers and could give them to you. So I just have been encouraging people to do that and to look at those numbers and to ask questions of their elected officials.
No doubt, for sure. And yeah, I think that's definitely what I got from it. I can't just, I was in the dark on a lot of these issues, which, again, pardon the pun, but, the title is very appropriate, for more than, because it's not just the title In the Dark. What was the impetus for that?
Because I think, in the dark means a bunch of things. So Jacob was kidnapped in the dark, but also, law enforcement accountability. I mean, these decisions are being made essentially in the dark. So to us, it meant both of these things. What happened to Jacob in the dark, but also what happens to us in a democracy when we are in the dark about what law enforcement is doing.
Okay, that's that's very good. Okay, cool. All right, well, I certainly appreciate it. There's so much more I could ask you. Like another time we can do another one where I want to talk more about the sex offender registry. I want your work on the Catholics in the Twin Cities there, and I like Minneapolis a lot, so I got some Minneapolis questions. So anyway, so maybe we can have you back on to talk about some other things when you have a chance. But
yeah, that would be great. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, no problem. If I could ask you for one more thing, if I could get a liner so I could prove that we've had another fascinating person on the show, if you could identify or introduce yourself and say you're a part of the vocal minority, I'll have that and play that in perpetuity.
So wait, what should I say? I'm Madeleine Baran.
Yeah, Madeleine Baran. If you want to fancy it up and say Peabody and your Columbia Award, or however you want to do it. APM. Whatever tagline you want to put on yourself, and that you're a part of the vocal minority.
Okay. I'm Madeleine Baran. I'm an investigative reporter, and I'm part of the vocal minority.
Beautiful. Nailed it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We appreciate it once again. So, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for listening and for, really digging into these questions. That's what we were hoping for.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, I'm so glad I found your show because, like I said, a lot of these shows have opened my mind more, but you really educated me in a way that I don't know that I fully expected. And thank you guys for your work and your whole and all your producers and everybody's work. And I wanted to make sure that the people who listen to our show, they're true crime fans or whatever, but they're also social justice and they need to know what's happening out here. So again, thank you very much for your time and for your guys' work. Hey, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that episode, that conversation with Madeleine Baran. As you could probably tell, I really enjoyed the conversation and that podcast. If you've been listening for a while, I like true crime, but more so, I like the podcast to go deeper into the subject, and that's certainly what In the Dark did here, as you can tell from our conversation. So make sure you check that out. It's highly rated in iTunes. I've seen it in the top 10 to top 50 for weeks and weeks and weeks. So easy to find, and the link is in the show notes. Make sure you check out the clearance rates for the Part 1 crimes as well. Make sure where you live in, see how safe it is, especially if you're living out there in one of these counties controlled by one of these sheriffs that maybe needs a little more attention. So check those numbers out. Thanks for your support. Use the hashtag #TheVocalMinority when you're on Facebook, when you're on Twitter, when you talk about the show. Follow the show at Vocal Report. Special thanks to Lizzie for her production help. Hey, shout out to my man, Shy Wright. Just had a surprise birthday party for him, actually. It was my first time ever doing a surprise birthday party. It was pretty dope. We celebrated with him. He is the guy that is responsible for the music on the show. So shout out to my boy. Happy birthday. Make sure you go to the website, thevocalminorityReport.com. Guest info, our survey under contribute, the store, buy a shirt, help the show out, subscribe, go to iTunes, leave a rating and review. We'll send you a shirt of your choice when you do that. Go to audibletrial.com/vocal report. That's audibletrial.com/vocal report for your free audiobook download and 30-day trial. Obviously, you like podcasts. If you listen to this, you like listening to anything. So if you have some time, go there, check it out. They've got over 180,000 titles to choose from. We've had guests that have books that are there. Go check them out, and make sure you go to audibletrial.com/vocal report. That'll really help out the show. All right, we'll holler at you next episode. We got a special 2-parter coming for you guys. Think you'll really enjoy. All power to the people. Peace.
This has been a Vocal Neighbors production.